At the time of the trauma, the brain was too hyper or too shut down to say, oh, this really sucks, but it will soon be over. Huh? And so once you get traumatized, the stuff keeps coming back as if it's still happening. And so then you need to get people in a different physiological state where they can actually say, oh, it happened, but it happened back then. So the core issue is to indeed create ways in which people's bodily states can feel calm and attentive. And then as you're in that state, you can revisit it very, very carefully. Say, that happened. Oh my God, it was awful. And our job as therapists is to help people to stay in a calm and observing mode.
Welcome to the Better Brain Podcast, where we talk about everything brain health for anyone who has a brain or knows somebody who does and wants to make it better.
Today, the guest is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, world-renowned expert in trauma. He's a psychiatrist, he's a researcher, and he's the author of the best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's been on the Amazon bestsellers for multiple years, also a New York Times bestseller. He's also involved now in some high-level psychedelic research into trauma, so we're going to talk to him about that. We had a fantastic conversation, and we hope you guys enjoy it.
So we're thrilled to have you here talking to us about trauma, a very important topic. But before we start, I wanted to tell you how I was introduced to your book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's about 4 years ago. I was taking care of a high school senior in the UCLA Brain Sport Clinic. She had a concussion about a year prior and was still experiencing headache, dizziness, brain fog, exercise intolerance, and something I had not heard about, depersonalization. Oh, yeah. And so she actually had a disconnection between how she felt and with her body, with her experiences. She saw her life pass by from third-person point of view, and it later turned out that she had early childhood sexual trauma.
So that's that stage
so
for
I,
that. Yeah. These
yeah.
experiences accumulate, and you learn certain ways of coping early on, or your networks get automatically activated in particular ways, and then it keeps coming back in various times in your life. Yeah.
Exactly. And so my neuropsychologist at the time recommended your book. I read it and got the insight into her horrific trauma and the manifestations that played out, as you just said, and kind of repeated as she had the physical trauma, in her teens. And we also leverage that information, your book, and recommend it to our wounded warriors, our young traumatized warriors coming back from the post 9/11
My book is doing well. It's because of your recommendations. Good.
So that brings us to where I want to start. Trauma. How would you define trauma, and does it have different forms?
Well, trauma is really the internal experience. So that trauma is getting overwhelmed by a particular experience, so your mind and your brain can no longer cope with it. It's really based on a deep sense of physical and existential helplessness. Like you stand by and go like, oh my God. And it has a lot to do with action, whether you're able to do something. If you cannot act, and I think that Jonas Du's work really illustrated beautifully, if you are exposed to a challenge, you can do something to activate a pathway of activation and competency. But if you're trapped at this point and held down and unable to move, then you activate a system of a collapse and trying to disappear from the situation. So it's really the brain, mind, organism gets confronted with a situation that it's completely helpless in the face of. And the second piece is, and nobody comes to your rescue. Because the situations like that happen a fair amount of the time. But if somebody says, I'll take care of it, you can sort of let go and let your mind and body be taken care of in some ways.
Yeah, that's incredible that, that it tells us about the importance of the support system surrounding people with that
Yeah,
experience
both
trauma.
support system and your action system. Like
Mm,
that's why you train policemen and EMTs and surgeons and soldiers how to really they train and train so that if they're exposed to a really tough situation, say, "Oh, I know what to do here." Uh, uh, so
hmm
that setting up these action patterns is also very terribly important. Yeah.
mm. Now, we understand trauma in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder, but especially fairly recently, there's been a field coming out about the big T's and the little T's,
Well, that's
right? So
not
the
basic.
big traumatic.
That's actually sort of not my favorite terminology, but the big T, little t, I think, if I get it right, is about one incident, which they call big T,
hmm
and chronic ongoing misery, which is called little
hmm
t. But for
hmm
most people, the ongoing misery is actually the real trauma. Uh, so,
mm
but the field hasn't really recognized yet, but when you're a clinician, which I also am, uh, the majority of people you see have been chronically neglected, chronically abused,
mm
chronically exposed. So, and to call that little t is not very respectful to my mind.
mm. What would you say we should call it then, if
I,
not little
I
T?
would call it attachment trauma,
Mm,
Mm.
or in our scientific articles, we call it developmental trauma, which
mm,
sometime posthumously, I'm sure, will be a diagnosis in DSM. But
hmm
up to now, uh, despite numerous scientific articles on that, it has not been accepted as a real diagnosis.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was, I think Kevin and I had discussed on the podcast a study of, I believe it was Korean War veterans in the Pacific Theater, where those that were exposed to this sort of state of chronic misery, whether that's the mosquitoes, the heat, and having that overlain on traumatic experiences, were potentially more predisposed to develop post-traumatic stress disorder over those that maybe hadn't been exposed to that sort of chronic state of misery. Can you
And
speak to
that's
that a
and
little bit?
that's just observations. So there's back in Guadalcanal in New
Mm-hmm.
Guinea. That's 80 years ago that we're talking about, uh,
Yeah.
and that's when people in the Anglo-Saxon world first woke up to that, and they looked at the circumstances. Then, if you go further and you look at what is people's early imprints, it gets even more complicated because if you're
Mm,
grown up with a violent alcoholic father and a frozen mother, uh, that has a whole other sort of preliminary impact on people. So the, this is a very complex situation. You cannot go like that and that or that. Um, but indeed, if you have prior experiences of like just needing to wait and be passive in whatever is happening to you, that really predisposes you to be much more vulnerable to trauma.
What about vicarious trauma? All the doom scrolling and watching the
Yeah.
news and social media.
Well, call me again a year from now to see how our political situation is going to end up. Like, whew.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Uh, but I think EMTs are a good example of vicarious trauma. They get
Hmm.
trained. They're very brave people. They often feel very confident. But how many car accidents can you see before it goes into your soul? How many the FBI agents, I think they're all fired now because it's now okay with the FBI, who watch kids getting molested on videotapes and stuff like that. How much of that can you see and still come back to yourself? And, people always said, every man has his breaking point. And for example, I haven't seen the latest figures, but some time ago I heard that um, the police in the USA pays more money for disability benefits than they do for salaries. That may or may not be true,
Wow.
but at some point, if you see enough just stuff that makes you feel helpless and miserable, it will have a big impact on you, and you may become heartless, but if you become heartless not only on your job, it spills over into your family, or you're upset and angry all the time, you cannot sleep, and it goes into your body, and you become ill.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what exactly makes an event traumatic? Are there universal traumas, or would you say trauma is in the eye of the beholder per se?
Well, the eye and the stomach and the hippocampus and the amygdala and the peripheral brain. All it's in the response of the organism is trauma. Uh,
Mm.
and the stuff that I treat, having a person see their kid run over by a drunk driver. Uh,
Mm,
How does anybody not get traumatized by that?
right.
Less
Mhm.
being gang raped. Uh, but there's always some people who do okay, who somehow are
Yeah.
able to create a mental construct that seems to help them to manage. Yeah.
Yeah. So, let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum, and I hope you understand my question. I would hate to have it miscommunicated, but do you think are we a traumatized society coming to the realization of how traumatized we are, or would you say that the term trauma in certain circumstances can be overextended to describe potentially events natural to the human condition?
No, I think, I'm quite a serious student of history. And uh, sometimes journalists say, Dr. Van der Kolk, why do you think the world is so much more traumatized than it was before? And I go like, if you ever take a history course, I'm actually astounded by is that objectively, the world, certainly the world that we live in, is much safer than it used to be.
Mhm.
Uh, Most people live in much more predictable and less threatening world. Small example. One of my grandfathers uh, got Parkinson's from the pandemic in 1919, and he was completely paralyzed and had to be taken care of. There was no social security. So on one side of the family, my family is just thrown into complete poverty. In our current situation in the US and in Europe, that wouldn't happen anymore. You would get some sort of support. Um, so life was much more dangerous until 1945 when Social Security came in and stuff like that. Um, what I'm puzzled about is how many people in 2024 are so preoccupied with relatively minor things, and they interpret that as making them very angry. When for most people, life is surprisingly good compared with that of their ancestors, actually. So there's also a social construct, and there may be a cultural issue that we start to expect that life is easier than it really is.
Hmm.
So it sounds like there are some ingredients internal that make an event traumatic to an individual, such as the predictability, the helplessness, the amount of support they have. Would you say that trauma is in our heads? Even though I think you've kind of flipped that on its head, if you will, and said it's the body keeps the score, that trauma is in the body.
Trauma is a subjective experience. It is um, like, you know, our great great grandmothers. They had 17 babies and three survived. Yeah? You know, somehow, somehow they dealt with it. In 2025, it would be horrendous because we don't expect it anymore. We don't prepare ourselves for that. Um, and it's not part of what life is supposed to be like. So the subjective interpretation actually makes quite a difference. But because none of us ever has lived in the 17th century, we don't quite know. But I've been to areas in India and Africa where life is really tough, and I can't imagine any of us living there without us feeling traumatized. Somehow
Mm.
they are
Yeah.
able to manage somehow. They also are very violent, anxious and nervous, and they drink a lot, and they do the usual post-traumatic things that people do to cope. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think there's something about their growing up that makes them prepared to deal with much rougher situations than the rest of us could. Yeah.
Well, take us back in your history where you came up with this idea that the body keeps the store, that keeps the score, that it stores trauma.
Well, it's not storing trauma. It's to keep the score. You feel it in your body.
Mm, mm.
And I've had some arguments with foreign translators who say, "Oh, the body doesn't forget." Well, that's not what I'm saying. But so the question, but this is actually it has two questions. One, once when did you first notice that, and the second one was when did you first have words for it? Those are two
Hmm.
very different things. And I think I noticed it as a baby, but I didn't have words for it till I was about 35 years old. So I
Mm.
grew up in the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War, and in retrospect, I think I saw a lot of bad things as a baby that I don't actually remember. Um, but I grew up among ruins. I grew up very much like kids in the Ukraine grow up these days. And so my interest in all came really from what's going on here, how can people do these terrible things to each other. But this was always a subtext that I was not aware of. It just sort of formed my interest. And then I worked with veterans. And the first day I came into veterans clinic with guys my age, I was really impressed with how collapsed their bodies were, how unenergetic their bodies were. And these guys they fought in the jungle and been helicopter pilots, so they really had been very physically very, very competent people. And I was impressed with how their bodies just weren't moving. And then
Mm.
my friend Judy Herman had a patient who gave her a picture of uh, a woman whose head had gone in the clouds. So you see her, the depersonalization stuff that you talked about earlier,
Right.
that I was incensed that person drew. And then she says, but my body kept the score. And that's where
Mm.
Mm.
I got the title of my book from, because I saw that picture and Judy showed it to me and said, yeah, that's it. The body keeps the score. Took
Wow.
35 years of my life before I had words for understanding something I, on some level, known for a very long time before. Yeah.
Mm.
Incredible.
Yeah. So, you know, so somehow it seems that trauma is, if not necessarily stored in the body, it's reflected in the body.
It is, it's,
Um,
it's played out. As my friend Peter Levine, I think, was the first person who said it, it's played out in the theater of your body. And actually, I'm writing about it right now, is the degree to which you keep thinking it's a mental event. And no, it's an event with the organism. Your organism becomes a traumatized organism. So many physical systems in your body go wrong. But already in medical school, again, you don't know where the motivation comes from. But in my senior year, I was supposed to do a research project, and I said I want to study the possibility that environmental events, life events, may have an impact on cancer. And I was called
Mm.
into the dean's office and said, that is a ridiculous question. We will not graduate you from medical school when you ask stupid questions like that. And I did graduate from medical school, but I still ask stupid questions like that. And in fact, since that time, a lot of evidence has come up that indeed, if you have long-term childhood trauma, you have an increased risk of cancer, an increased risk of drug addiction, increased risk uh, of all kind of illnesses. Uh, uh, so yes, it goes into the body, but not sort of that causes what? It just makes you more vulnerable. There's a study
Mm.
a few years ago in public health in the Washington D.C. area. and they found that the average life expectancy in Chevy Chase, where a bunch of my friends live, uh, is now 92 years old. I also fully expect to live to be about 92, 94 years old because if you come from privilege, you can pretty much count on your body being enveloped in criticism. It's a privilege. People in Anacostia have a life expectancy of 63.
Wow.
Mm,
And they don't
incredible.
all have the same disease, but your whole body becomes less capable of surviving some days. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. We know post-traumatic stress disorder increases the risk of dementia, all-cause mortality. I think also, as far as adverse childhood experiences are, the an ACE
Yeah.
score greater than
Right.
6 relative to ACE score greater than 0 um, increases your chance of suffering from 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States by
Exactly.
15%. This is something that came out of your book, which was
And
striking.
what's also
Um,
so there's now an edict from the National Science Foundation of a number of subjects that can no longer be studied. New regime that includes disabilities, it includes trauma, it includes anything having to do with what we're talking about. Our new regime is not allowed to allowing people to study this anymore.
So, what is the mechanism, though, underlying that
For me, the
connection?
mechanism,
It's probably very
the
difficult to
mechanism is
ascertain, but
what makes a political system forbid people looking at this. That's actually,
no, I actually meant, I might have misspoke, but I meant the mechanism
yeah, yeah.
between trauma, post traumatic stress disorder, and all these end organ issues. Like, what is that mediating factor?
That's very clear. So, um, because you have this system in the back of your brain, your limbic system and your autonomic nerve system, that basically is there to monitor the state of your body and to interpret whether something is dangerous or safe. And there's an unspeakable amount of evidence that shows that once you get traumatized, the networks in the primitive part of your brain get disturbed, so your body always experiences that you're in danger. So even objectively, you may calmly sit in a room, your body keeps sending messages to you. Better be careful. People are going to hurt you. People are going to hit you. But it's not. That's not in the forebrain. It's not in the cognitive brain. It's like your dog who starts whimpering when there's a thunderstorm going on. That's that part of the brain. Yeah.
Mm. And you've talked about the insula in the past, this
Right.
kind of gatekeeper for visceral or organ
Yeah.
information, how fast the heart's beating, how fast you're breathing, and so on, the health of your gut. Can you just talk a little bit more about that, the
No, no,
connection between body and brain?
actually, the person you want to interview on this is my old student Ruth Lanius, who is really the
Hmm.
foremost researcher on these issues. And she really has uncovered that the many networks that are going on in the back of the brain. For example, there is an area of the brain just above your brainstem. I call it the cockroach brain. In science, call it the periaqueductal gray. And
Hmm.
if you are well put together person, that system of your in your brain is always quiet until there's a danger. And when she looks at people who are traumatized, the system is always just subtle little messages all the time, like I'm in danger, I'm in danger, I'm in danger. Your forebrain says there's nothing going on, but the back of your brain keeps saying you're in danger.
Mm-hmm. Incredible.
Your book has been translated to over 40 languages.
47
It's
languages.
one of the
Yeah.
bestsellers. Oh my God. And I'm sure courses are taught on it. And with all the fans you have, I'm sure there are critics. I just wonder, what is the biggest argument against the body keeps the score in your
Well,
mind?
I don't read all the critics, but actually, there have been surprisingly few.
Hmm.
And the critics say it is not scientific. I've only 64 pages of references at the end of the book. Uh, the critics say nobody respects him. The critics say he has gone off the deep end. You know,
Sounds like you've heard that previously in your life
like
and
oh,
pushed right through.
envy is a very powerful force, and so if you be successful, there's always some people who try to put you down. Like it's the way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, But
One of my
scientifically, I've seen basically no serious counter things.
one of my favorite scientists and my PhD advisor, Lisa Feldman Barrett, put out a video on the Big Think in 2023, saying it's not the body that keeps the score, it's the brain, and the body is the scorecard. I just wondered, is it semantics that we're talking about, or is there something
That is
there?
semantic, indeed. I would agree
Hmm.
with that sentence completely. About your
Hmm.
scorecard, like
Yeah.
I hope
Amazing. So why don't
I hope they should say it antagonistically. I mean, more the clarifying.
No.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So can we turn to some treatments now? Um, I've heard you say that you can't use logic to talk someone out of trauma because trauma isn't logical. That's can be pretty provocative for some people. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Well, you know, our brain is largely not a rational brain. We do our stuff, we eat. Why do you eat that form of cheese and not that form of cheese? Why do you wear that shirt and not that shirt? You can make a rationale for it, but that's just a superficial explanation that has nothing to do with the reality of why you do that. And so most of us is really quite irrational. And we have a little rational brain. But for example, if you have let's say you have a year and a half old child, that child is crying in the middle of the night. You can explain to that child how, if they cry through the night, it will really make you very tired for the rest of the day, and then you may get fired from your job, and you may become an alcoholic after you get fired. And so, please ask your 1.5-year-old not to cry. Um, but I doubt whether it will really be very helpful. Huh? Um,
Hmm.
and so, uh, people have these feelings not because they are stupid. People have these feelings because they get signals from their body that something is going on. And but people think that's irrational, you shouldn't feel that way. Uh, they also probably know that's irrational, you shouldn't feel that way, but they feel that way. And so our job is not to tell people how stupid they are that they feel that way. Our job is actually get people to not feel that way.
Hmm.
Did you receive some kind of buy-in from patients by telling them um, trauma is in the body? The reason I ask is when I'm speaking with patients, oftentimes they're getting the message that it's all in their heads. And I come out and say, hey, it is all in your heads. The brain and the mind are in your head. And so that's what we're talking about. It's constructing the experience of what you're going through. But have you found success because you've been able to talk about this kind of subconscious effect of trauma?
Well, you know how it is. People come to see you because they have read The Body Keeps the Score. People come to see me because I'm a trauma expert. So uh, I don't get blowback from my patients, but I also have a selected group of patients. So there may be people who say, no, it's not in my body, it's in my head, but they don't come to see me. So
I guess I'm asking, are you able to get through to people a little bit easier? I find that as one of the most challenging conversations I have to have. I just looking for kind of advice, insight, experience you've had.
I really, no, I run into very little blowback. I give incessant lectures. Just came from 2 weeks of lecturing in Mexico. A wonderful time. I get a lot of questions, a lot of feedback from people, a lot of supplementary stories, hopefully supplementary scientists who work on similar issues that I work on. But in my daily life, I get almost no blowback.
Hmm. So, can you provide us some insight into these cognitive-based therapies then for post-traumatic stress disorder, like exposure therapy, for example? This sort of top-down approach to treating trauma. What are your thoughts on
Well, I
that?
thought the thing is, you cannot resolve the trauma until unless you revisit it and make it into a memory. But
Mm.
if you blast people with a trauma, you create the same physiological conditions under which the trauma occurs, and you basically re-traumatize people. And so you
Mm.
can blast people with things, and then they become desensitized, but then become desensitized in general. They don't get just desensitized for feeling. That's a remarkable thing. They also get desensitized to their children and to their lovers, and like everything gets
Mm.
shut down. So I think that's a horrible thing, actually.
Mm.
But
I like
yeah,
the. Go ahead. I like the idea of kind of coming in through body focused therapies in a bottom up approach. I'm always thinking about the amygdala and the implicit emotion regulation circuits that are involved in maybe movement, or as you've talked about, theater and yoga, mindfulness, meditation, things like that that change the body's state and in turn change the
the
mind.
core is you need to get the brain in the state that it can process what happens.
Hmm.
At the time of the trauma, the brain was too hyper or too shut down to say, oh, this really sucks, but it will soon be over. Huh? And so once you get traumatized, the stuff keeps coming back as if it's still happening. And so then you need to get people in a different physiological state where they can actually say, oh, it happened, but it happened back then. And so the
Hmm.
core issue is to indeed create ways in which people's bodily states can feel calm and attentive. And then as you're in that state, you can revisit it very, very carefully. Say, that happened. Oh my God, it was awful. And stay, and our job as therapists is to help people to stay in a calm and observing mode. And there's many different ways of doing that. EMDR is a great way of doing it. Yoga seems to be helpful. Tai Chi seems to be helpful. Neurofeedback seems to be helpful. My last 10 years, I've been studying psychedelic agents, incredibly helpful. Uh, Hypnosis used to be used for this. So there is no one way of doing that, but all good methods in common is to help people to be in a state of physical safety and mindful observation.
Mm. All right, so the podcast is brought to you by Contact Medical Services. This service puts you in touch with a verified concussion physician specialist within 24 hours of you having your injury. This is virtually unheard of anywhere in the country, and there's good reason for it. It's because our current healthcare system doesn't allow us to get to the specialists we need to get to in a timely manner. And when you're talking about brain injury, that's particularly important. A service like this could prevent the consequences of having a concussion, such as persistent cognitive and memory issues, headaches, psychological issues. So we're proud that they're sponsoring the podcast. We'll put their website at the bottom in the YouTube description. Please check them out. And let's keep going with the episode. Now, so we'll talk about psychedelics in a little bit, but give us some insight into how to fold in yoga and some of these other practices that you mentioned into the actual therapy that would be required for us to navigate that trauma.
Well, I think it's important for therapists like us to realize that we're just a small part of the whole overall process, and that we are not in charge of people's healings. We are the people who know how to talk with people and do know something about trauma, but maybe your karate teacher knows more than you do about some things, and maybe your singing teacher knows more than you do, and maybe your yoga teacher knows more than you do. So we're just one of many people who help people to heal. And very important to be aware. And I've been exposed to a lot of other things because people invite me to see it um, around the world. That see that, oh, by doing this sort of dancing, people really feel calm and feel more in control. Um, Been to China a bunch of times. Every morning in China, billions of Chinese are doing Tai Chi.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if you live in China, you need to do Tai Chi. Maybe in America right now, we all should be doing Tai Chi as the fascists are taking over. Like, uh, And you need to calm that body down in order to deal with terrible situations. Uh, and so different cultures have different ways of doing it. And psychotherapists in the US, by and large, don't learn how to do that.
Mm.
I like the way that you talk about creating new body states in social settings with other people, and it expands beyond some of the situations you just mentioned into things like marching or singing along and other things that bring groups together. Can you just talk about that?
Oh, no, it's interesting. I'm a great fan of that. That Japanese factory workers would do these exercises and singing together. Not
Hmm.
whether they do that anymore. Uh, in South Africa and Rwanda and in Latin America, I've seen people doing a lot of body stuff to help themselves to calm themselves down. So I've seen it elsewhere. I've also tried to get grants to study those things, but the National Institute of Health is still sort of in the CBT mode. So it's almost
Hmm.
impossible to get funds to study that. Uh,
Mm.
but uh, clearly, every culture has evolved some ways of calming yourself down. And when I travel to other countries, which I do a lot, I always first thing I do is, what do these people have that we don't have? Uh,
Hmm.
because I've seen, like, I worked with Bishop Tutu in South Africa, and like he was the best trauma therapist I've ever seen. And he sang with people and danced with people and prayed with people. So like, "Hey, this guy's for something."
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and something that you mentioned in your book is trauma. There's some trauma survivors that tend to gravitate to these really intense forms of
Yeah,
exercise routines, right? Like ultra marathoners, for
yeah,
example, is a
yeah.
good example of that. Um, Give us some insight into that. That's something that sounds like you would expect, but is it something that people should lean
No,
into? What are
no,
your thoughts?
that actually, I had a bunch of Vietnam veterans who I met when they were 35 years old or something, or 34, and who became marathon runners, and it really seemed to help them, and they were doing very well. And my great worry was they can only be a marathon runner for so long. What is
Mm-hmm.
going to happen when they break a leg or the muscles stiffen up? And indeed, they did very poorly uh,
Mm-hmm.
after they were not able to do it. So I think ultra stuff can be very helpful to keep you in a to use all that energy and all that physiological arousal to to stay calm, but they can't stay calm when they're sitting down. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, nothing wrong with it, but all of us decline at some point, and you cannot continue to do that.
Yeah, so I think that leads in really well into the psychedelic discussion,
Okay?
right? Certainly, you're not running around and moving around with psychedelics. Um, Encouraging data coming out for the psychedelics treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. Unfortunately, recently the FDA, I guess, denied approval of psychedelics, MDMA specifically for
Bizarre.
post-traumatic stress disorder.
I was quite an important part of this study, actually. Um,
Yeah.
it's a bizarre discussion. I came in late in the study, so if I had designed it, I would have designed it somewhat differently. And but my main criticism of the study was it was a side effect study. Uh,
Mm.
they looked at PTSD, but psychedelics are don't our creator did not design psychedelics to treat a DSM diagnosis.
Hmm.
But so they want to have it approved for this arbitrary, unscientific notion of PTSD. And so they studied PTSD. They didn't really study a lot of other mental phenomena. I had some measures in there that I think were the most important measures in the study, but nobody seemed to be interested in that.
Can you tell us about it?
No, let me first tell you that we studied side effects because we want to have it approved, and there were no side effects. And then when the FDA came, none of whom knew anything about PTSD or psychedelics, they said the the risks outweigh the benefits. We had no side effects in our study. We did an extraordinarily careful study. We made people as safe as could be. There were no side effects. So that was a crazy study. The benefits were stupendous. Huh? It did indeed dramatically decrease PTSD in 68% of people, not everybody. Um, but the secondary data that I was in charge of, actually, for me, even much more interesting because the MDMA caused a vast increase in self-compassion.
Mm.
As you know from working with traumatized people, when you're in your trauma, you can't stand yourself, you hate yourself, you think you're contaminated, you think dirty or disgusting, weak, whatever. People have very negative senses about themselves. And what's really stunning, and we measure that, is on MDMA over time, was not short lasting. People say, I am this person. I'm a precious person. I'm a special person. It's a very common effect on in our study was a lot of them were very abused people said, oh, I was really a lovely child. And too bad my dad was an alcoholic and never got to enjoy what a wonderful child I was.
Mm.
Oh, my dad was so traumatized himself. I feel so sad for my dad that he had to drink all the time and was and didn't get any private being a father because he had his own trauma. And you saw this deep compassion that sort of pervaded people, not only for themselves, but even for their perpetrators. Well, that's sort of a big deal. Uh, Second thing is alexithymia, which is a fancy word. It is not being able to say what you feel, not being able to say, why did I get so angry or what frightened me? There's no internal observation of oneself. A very common income. Uh, the, fir- the first interview I had after my book came out was from a radio host in Philadelphia who was running a program for gangs. And he said to me, no, Dr. Van der Kolk, I'd like to talk with you about alexithymia. And I said, alexithymia, that's the only non-four-letter word in my book because I worked so hard on making it understandable. He said, well, I can't help it because that's what my gang members suffer from. They do things, but they have no idea why they do it. They just have
Mm.
impulses. And so we measured alexithymia with MDMA, and people said, oh, this is what I'm doing, and this is what I'm feeling, and therefore I do that. So they got a deep verbal connection with themselves. Half of the people got MDMA plus therapy, the other half got therapy only. The therapy only people did not do nearly as well, even on alexithymia. Now, if there's anything you
Mm-hmm.
think you can do as a psychotherapist, is help people to find language for their internal experience. We work on that stuff. But the MDMA really helped people to say, oh, now I know what I'm feeling and where it comes from. And then the third dimension we looked at is being able to regulate your emotions, be able to understand other people's emotions, dramatic improvement on it. Really was, it's the most beautiful piece of work I've done in my long career, actually. It was just great to see
Wow.
it.
I mean,
Well,
this
legal, yeah,
this sounds like it's way more effective than some other treatments that are out there in many ways. I know it's not a head-to-head comparison, but it should be looked at. And I'm just wondering, what do you think is the mechanism here that's not being captured with, I don't know, pharmacology or some of the exposure therapy and other treatment
discussion
strategies?
about this. And I think MDMA may be different from ketamine, which I do use in my treatment. I don't use MDMA because it's illegal. They don't do illegal things. Uh, it's different psilocybin. It's different from DMT. So, what's so intriguing is that you have very different chemical systems, but they all seem to create a mental state in which the ordinary way that your brain has been organized to perceive reality lets go. And so, uh, I'm sure you guys have done your share of psychedelics, shouldn't you? Tell me if I'm wrong.
You are absolutely wrong. I have no idea what you're
Good.
talking about and can't relate at all.
And so you know that it blows your mind. And when you're on psychedelics, you see other realities, you see other things, and you sort of rearrange your uh, your configuration of how your mind automatically has come to perceive the world. It's very clear that this integration of the normal organization of the mind helps the mind to reorganize itself in a way that uh, nothing else that I've seen can do, with the exception possibly of what Milton Erickson used to do in hypnosis. But
Mm.
nobody does that anymore. But that would be the head-to-head I would like to see. Can we do it with very deep hypnosis?
So,
Yeah, I heard you say in your book, and correct me if I'm mistaken with how I understand this, but being present is a prerequisite to any kind of therapy you're going to be going into for post traumatic stress disorder, any trauma based mental illness. If that's correct, then how do psychedelics fit into this? Do they allow you to be more present?
No,
You know.
it's not, well, it's being, in order to do therapy, you need to be able to observe yourself
Mm-hmm,
and observe yourself lovingly, which is
mm-hmm,
a little bit different from being present, but you need to be aware.
mm-hmm,
And uh, when you're in the post-traumatic state, you just have a lot of feelings, a lot of impulses, but you don't have like, oh, I'm really frightened because, you don't have that observing quality because you're too agitated to shut down. On psychedelics, you don't become particularly agitated, but your mind does weird things to you, where you do live in another reality, and your mind sort of creates new networks to to understand the world. And I think that
do
they
you
all have in common. Yeah.
do you think there's a common thread between psychedelics and some of the other body-based therapies like EMDR or neurofeedback that's helpful?
To some degree, but no. So I've studied EMDR. I've been the only person who got funded by the National Institute of Health to do that. I think EMDR is a wonderful treatment. Is it similar to psychedelics? Not really. We also did some mechanism study, and we showed that indeed EMDR just changed some brain circuitry, so your brain is able to understand what happened to you through a different channel, and your body sort of is let go, so your mind can take over and say, "Yeah, it really happened, but it happened to me a long time ago." Your sense of time comes alive, but to say it's similar to psychedelics, I wouldn't say so.
I've heard you say that you don't trust words, and I think if I understood you correctly, I agree with your point of view that talking about internal mental states is difficult, and it's subjective, and it sounded like what you meant by that was you trust the body and
Well,
its response or reaction
no,
or
when you're a writer, to say you don't like words is sort of weird. Look, I think words are terribly important. The words we use with each other are terribly important. And you can ask me questions. Is it really true? And I can ask you questions. Did you ever take that? And you can say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. um, Talking is tremendously important in order to define yourself, to persuade other people, think, to make plans, to make relationships. And so words are terribly important. And understanding what your trauma is also terribly important. Being able to say, this happened to me is terribly important and not keep a secret for yourself. So I'm not at, I'm a verbal psychotherapist primarily. I'm also a body therapist, um, but I think don't underestimate the power of words to be a human being and a conscious human being. Having words for your trauma, I don't think makes your trauma go away. But having worked for your trauma can be very helpful. And you can say, sorry, I don't want to go drive in a car today because the way you drive reminds me about the time that I got in a terrible car accident. And then makes me feel very upset. No, I'm not going to go with this person because that person reminds me of somebody who once raped me. And that doesn't mean that he's a rapist, but my body feels like he's a rapist. So I'm not going to go and mess with this guy. But the fact that you can say
Uh,
that he might mention a rapist, you can say, well, obviously he isn't your rapist. You can say, yeah, my forebrain knows it, but the back of my brain still interprets me as a rapist. Yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds like, we're not, the goal isn't to get rid of the trauma, it's learn how to navigate and live with it. Would you say that's
No,
an accurate
not,
statement?
well, getting rid of it. No, no, the goal of treatment is really to put it in perspective and to really be able to say, yes, it happens. And it happened when I was 3 years old. It had a certain impact on me, but today is February 2025, and I'm in San Francisco.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, being going through med school, I don't think that we learned enough about this and how to speak to people who have been traumatized or
That's
have
for sure.
um, uh, other mental illnesses that could affect their physiology, that could affect the very illness that they've come to the hospital with. And I just wonder, do you think we're failing in trying to educate the next generation of physicians? Is there something we could do better?
Um, yeah, you know, no, but I see medical school, and I saw it in myself also, is is that you get so overwhelmed by your patients and by all the stuff that you have to learn that there is no room for yourself and your growth, really. What I'm struck by, I was struck with myself in medical school, and I still regularly teach in various medical schools. And the freshmen are much more healthier people than the seniors. The medical education itself is so brutalizing. There's just so much that you you become less and less capable there's so much to learn that that's not the time you teach people how to talk nicely to patients. I think that's when the great stress is over, you can do that. But I wouldn't. I, I teach the freshmen in medical school a little bit at the end of the senior year, maybe. But for the rest of the time, they have to learn surgery and gynecology and all that stuff. And just good luck studying as hard as you can.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that uh, that's a good space for us to move on to where do you see the field of trauma? It certainly has come a long way since you began as a staff psychiatrist, right? In your book, you describe the fact that, PTSD wasn't even really a diagnosis, let alone any sort of treatment availability for traumatized individuals. Um, so you certainly come a long way, or the field of trauma
No,
has. Where do you see it going?
no. I, my point is that 30 years ago we knew nothing, and now we know a little more than nothing. You know, psychiatrists are not like dentists. My dentist knows some stuff. But when I go to my dentist, I know he'll fix my teeth. It's precise, it's accurate, it's predictable. We are a profession that is still in its infancy. We have so much to learn and so much to study. The human mind is incredibly complicated. So we're learning a little bit about the brain. It also is an unspeakably complex subject. And what I'm impressed with is that even in our field, people may know something about the amygdala, but they know nothing about frontal lobe. They certainly know nothing about how to be with a foster child. They certainly don't know how to talk to a policeman. This field is just unspeakably complex. And
Hmm.
I think anybody who is not modest about what we can do is not to be trusted in a way. And so, yes, we have learned some things. And then there's another problem in our field is that people tend to get very religious. And if they have learned one method, they say, I have found the answer. No, you have learned one method that's helpful for some people, some of the time, in particular cultural context.
So would you say the same thing about psychedelics then?
Oh,
Because certainly there's a religiosity around
no, yeah,
psychedelics.
actually, I enjoy the psychedelic world I live in. I think I see a lot of curiosity, and actually, every single one of my colleagues, and we live in that world as a scientist these days, um, they're a modest group of people. They have a
Mm,
lot of hypotheses, and but nobody says I have found the answer.
mhm,
That makes it part of what makes it enjoyable to me is that people are really say, let's see. I wonder if, oh, I had a patient for whom that worked. Oh, I had a patient for whom that didn't work. And we're
mm,
still the beginning, these beginning phases of the development of something is always a great part to be part of it because people haven't found the answer yet. That means that people tend to be open-minded. Um, but no, I don't see anybody. I don't meet people in the psychedelic world to say, this is the right drug or this is the right experience. What I'm worried about is that uh, our capitalistic industry will take the relationships and the setting out of uh, the psychedelic world. And I think there's a very real danger. That, it, that
Mhm.
we did a study where we paid exquisite attention to set and setting. Our therapists were wonderful and careful and spent an enormous amount of time with people, a lot of debriefing, a lot of integrating. And if you blow your mind, you need to have people around you who are really very attentive to you and that you really have time to process what happened, what you saw, what you experienced, and what they see. There's a tendency already to just give people a drug as if it was Prozac or penicillin. And the critical issue for when you mess with the mind, that the mind needs to have a chance to really integrate what happens. And with the studies coming out on uh, opening of critical periods, that's really very exciting. Paul Dolan's work uh, shows that psychedelics open up capacity for the brain to take in stuff that it wasn't able to take before. And so if the context in which drugs are being given is not exquisite, paid attention to, your brain may actually have taken experiences that are horrible and dangerous. And so
mm.
setting of what your brain is exposed to at that point and for this at least the 72 hours afterwards is terribly important.
Mhm. Do you anticipate any FDA approval in the near future within the next 3 to 5 years?
And yes, and certainly having a former heroin addict now, it was confirmed as our Secretary of Education, having the guy run the government who is obviously on ketamine. I'm sure we'll see some openings in the direction. Whether the openings will be in the right direction, I'm not so sure of.
Mm, excellent.
Understood. Um, so, one thing that strikes me that's profound about your work and work in trauma is that the mind, brain, and body are not so dichotomous or so different from one another. And I think it's something that the field is still trying to wrap its head around. Psychiatrists and neurologists may be treating the same organ, but they call it different
Yeah.
things and use different language around it, and patients get confused. What do you think about
Well,
that?
it depends who you hang out with. Like yes, medical schools and mainstream hospitals is that department, that department, that department. But it's not. That's not the world I live in. The world that where you where the people who you're interested in deal with trauma and traumatized people. You really, uh, I live in the world of body workers and people who work with the body, know that sort of stuff. But I may live in a very small subculture of society.
No.
Yeah. What about resilience or protective mechanisms against post-traumatic stress disorder or the adverse consequences of trauma? Are these things that can be learned,
Yeah.
acquired, or do you think there's an element of it that's genetically
Oh,
predetermined?
no. John Lennon put it right. All you need is love. If you feel loved and surrounded by people who care for you, makes all the difference in the world. Human connections are critically important, and being helped to actually do things that make you feel competent and strong um, is terribly important. And so just take a pill is a terrible attitude. And dealing with trauma, you need to actually continue to move. You need to continue to do. And for that, you need people who encourage you to not go with the natural passivity that comes after trauma, and restore a sense of agency, sense of I can do, and restore a sense of fun. Which
Hmm.
fun never gets mentioned in psychiatry, but have is
You've
terribly important.
you've mentioned love support a couple of times on this episode. Has that always been something that you knew would be a absolute prerequisite for some sort of resiliency or recovery from trauma, or is this something that you've really come to know more recently in your practice and
That, that really,
in
that
your
really is
world?
something that emerged. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I was trained in a program where we very much cared deeply for the patients we saw. Uh, and so it's part of my training also. But the reality of support comes also very much from my clinical practice, where,
Mm-hmm.
where not being seen, not being known, not being paid attention to really was a
Mm-hmm.
gigantic risk factor all the time. Yeah, for
Yeah, incredible.
people. The work of
Well,
John Bowlby was important.
Yeah. Um,
Okay.
so this has been amazing. I think we're getting close to the time, but we wanted to do a closer with you, something that we could try to do to get out the most accessible, actionable insights to end on. And so we call it the 3-2-1 closer. Off the top of your head, I'm going to ask you a few questions and you can give us your responses. But can you tell us 3 fictions or myths in the field of trauma, 2 of the most important truths in the field of trauma, and 1 thing anybody anywhere could do to work on healing trauma?
So number it's not fiction, not like novels. It's about misperceptions. Is it correct?
yeah, like a
Yes,
myth.
exactly.
Um, Misperception is that you can uh, talk people out of it, or that other people can do it for you.
Hmm.
You know, it is your life, it's your body. At the end, uh, you need to find a way of taking charge of your body and your mind again. And so I cannot do this for you. And so the help, you have coaches from the outside, you have support from the outside, but at the end, it's up to you, which is very hard when you're
Hmm.
traumatized. Yeah. So that was the
Uh,
fiction that somebody can do it for you. But society,
yeah. Are there other fictions or myths that are out there in the influencer-driven world of pseudoscience or in
well, it's another
so,
thing is that a pill will make it go away. Uh,
mm,
for trauma, that's certainly not the case. Yeah.
no?
Mm-hmm.
And how about truths? 2 of the most important truths that you know in trauma.
But it is that we all need people on our side.
Mm,
And we need to be known to people. And we all need to have a feeling that I mean something to people. And the industrialization of medicine is a very disastrous development. You know, it's interesting. I live in the middle of Harvard hospitals and stuff, but my main medical care I get in a rural clinic in northern Vermont. The same
hmm.
clinic that Bernie Sanders goes to, because my doctor there knows me and sing together. You know, he takes
Wow.
time to
Wow.
see me, and so the industrialization of medicine has been disastrous, and the insurance companies running medicine has been a disaster. You know.
Hmm, hmm. And how about 1 thing anybody anywhere could do to begin their healing?
Okay. Well, in general, so take care of yourself. Now find out, really figure out what makes you feel safe and what is it that you really, when you do it, you feel like yourself. And there's not virtual things like playing computer games.
Hmm, hmm.
That is, was Child, the book, Johnson's Child, book about the anxious generation is a very profound book, actually. How the danger that of us getting our kicks out of screens and not out of people is It's a very serious thing.
Incredible. Dr. Kolk, it was an honor. Thank you so much for the time. We learned so much, and we hope to continue to learn and to grow. And thank you for everything you've contributed to the field of trauma, and you continue to contribute to the field of trauma clearly in the psychedelic space. I'm personally grateful for the work that you've done, your time, and all the wisdom that you shared with us today.
Thank you. It's fun being with you guys. Good luck to you.
You too.
I'll
Take
listen to
care.
your other podcasts. Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Bye-bye.
it. Bye.
All right, everybody. There you have it. Dr. Kolk. That was an absolutely incredible episode. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them below. But most importantly, be better.